Chapter 2. The Core Axioms, the Fundamental Pillars of their Ism. The first chapter of this portrait traced Heraclitus in the streets of Ephesus and the fevered air of a mind that would not settle for settledness. If the man was a river-tamer of words and a smuggler of paradoxes, the present chapter seeks to map the bedrock on which his doctrine rests. For any movement that calls itself Panta Rei, everything flows, all is in flux, must be anchored by certain propositions that do not drift with the current. These propositions, or axioms, function as the fundamental pillars of their ism. They hold the structure upright when the surface ripples. They grant us a way to think when the world insists on changing the topic before we can finish a sentence. They are not universal laws in the mathematical sense. They are lamps by which we might navigate a world of becoming. The axioms begin with a posture, a stance toward what counts as knowledge, reality, and existence. They insist that change is not a mere backdrop, but the very theater in which anything meaningful occurs. They insist that opposites are not adversaries, but essential partners in the choreography of the cosmos. They insist that the principle behind the appearances, the logos, a word that both communicates and orders, rules not with certainty, but with intelligibility born from relationship. If one thing can be said to be the heartbeat of Heraclitus' philosophy, it is that the pulse of the universe is a pulse of becoming, and the pulse is felt most keenly where the apparent certainties are torn apart and reassembled. Axiom I. Flux as the only constant, Panta Rei as the governing rule. The most famous line attributed to Heraclitus is compact and almost brutal in its honesty. Everything flows, and you cannot step into the same river twice. This is not merely a rhetorical flourish, but a claim about the nature of being. To be is to be in a process. To exist is to participate in perpetual becoming. Yet this axiom is not a license for nihilistic drift. It is a discipline. If all is in motion, there are consequences for how we live, decide, and judge. The axioms of Panta Rei do not permit us the luxury of a fixed stage on which to view a changing drama. They demand that we adjust our bearings as the scene unfolds. In practice, this axiom functions as a critique of static metaphysics. Any attempt to describe a fixed essence, a timeless form, or an unchanging substance is an overreach, an attempt to domesticate the river. The world, in this sense, resists reclassification. Yet Heraclitus does not invite us to surrender to flux without guidance. Rather, he asks us to develop a sense for patterns within change. If nothing endures in the strict sense, some patterns endure in the relative sense. Habits of nature, tendencies of systems, and the recurring motifs that emerge as the world reconfigures itself. To recognize these patterns is to practice a form of prudence. The axiom enjoins humility before the vastness of becoming and a stubborn curiosity about how change operates, not simply whether it occurs. Axiom 2. The logos as order within change, reason as a map, not a cage. Where the first axiom asserts the universality of flux, the second asserts that there is a governing principle that makes the flux intelligible. Heraclitus introduces the logos, a rational principle that orders phenomena without freezing them into static particulars. Logos is not a decree handed down from on high. It is the intelligible pattern one discerns in the tumult. It is the way by which the mind can speak of what is happening without misrepresenting it as something immovable. In practice, logos operates as a methodological commitment. Assume that events have reasons, even if those reasons lie beyond ordinary comprehension. Seek the connections that reveal how one change leads to another, and beware of the habit of treating appearances as if they exhaust reality. The logos is also a warning and a promise. It warns against the temptation to reduce contradiction to absurdity. The world does not yield a single, simple rule that eliminates tension. Opposites are not contradictions to be resolved away. They belong to the same fabric, each defining and clarifying the other. The promise of logos is modest but robust. Through careful attention to the way things relate, we can discern an order, a rational thread, that gives coherence to the apparent chaos. The axiom thus invites a disciplined mode of inquiry, one that respects both the power of reason and the stubborn particularity of phenomena. Axiom 3. The unity and the tension of opposites. Becoming arises from conflict. Heraclitus is often associated with the idea that the world is a dynamic tension produced by opposing forces. The famous fragments suggest that opposites are necessary for life to be what it is, and that one must understand the self by recognizing the other. The road up and the road down are one and the same, he notes, an image that compresses the insight. Distinctions that seem to divide are, at their core, continuities of a single process. The unity of opposites does not imply a reconciliation that eliminates difference. It implies that difference is the engine of continuity. This axiom has both metaphysical and ethical implications. Metaphysically, it denies any absolute final state of affairs. Everything is in motion, and the meaning of a thing is inseparable from what its opposite would imply. Epistemologically, it cautions the mind against simplistic dichotomies. Politically and ethically, it invites a stance of restraint and generosity. To understand a person, a community, or a culture, one must recognize the pressures and tensions that shape its behavior. Without friction, there is no growth. With it, there is the possibility of transformation. The unity of opposites is not a permit to indulge in cynicism. It is a guiding principle for navigating a world in which every solution sows the seed of a later question. Axiom 4. Fire as archie or principle of transformation, energy as the primary dynamic. Fire serves a symbolic and practical function in Heraclitus' thought. It is not merely a material element, but a representation of transformation, energy, and the perpetual birth-death cycle of the world. Fire consumes, yet what it consumes becomes the fuel for new forms. The relentless change of fire stands as a poetic analog for the cosmos. Nothing burns forever in the same way, yet the fire itself, in a sense, never dies. It renews itself through the very act of consuming what it has already consumed. In this axiom, fire is not chosen as an isolated metaphor, but as a way of thinking about causation and consequence. If the primary dynamic is transformation, then conditions, causes, and effects cannot be pinned to stable substances. The world is a field of ongoing rearrangements. Energy circulates, states of being flicker into new states. Entities are, if one permit the metaphor, embers that never quite vanish but shift into different shapes. The axiom invites a reverence for process as such, and for the art of watching rather than pinning down. It is also an invitation to humility in the face of a cosmos that defies final conclusions about origins or endpoints. Axiom V. The relational measure of things, relativity as the ground of evaluation. Axioms of this school insist that to measure anything is to situate it in a particular framework, and that frameworks are themselves products of history, language, and circumstance. What is considered short or long, good or bad, near or far, depends on the comparison being made. There is no absolute yardstick that renders all scales equivalent. Instead, measurement is a practice, a poetry of comparison in which judgments are always context-bound. This axiom has a practical corollary. Moral, political, and aesthetic judgments must acknowledge their own relativity. The best one can aspire to is a defensible standard grounded in the specific purposes and perspectives at hand, tempered by an awareness of alternative axes of evaluation. It is not a license for relativism to win by default, but an insistence that certainty must bear the marks of its own limitations. In social life, this translates into a call for nuanced persuasion, careful listening, and an acknowledgement that every grand claim carries with it costs. The axiom thus crafts a posture of thoughtful restraint. We speak with confidence about the patterns we discern, but we suspend hubris about universal applicability. Axiom 6. Knowledge as experiential, interpretive, and provisional. In the Heraclitean lens, knowledge is not a mirror reflecting the world with unblemished clarity. It is more like a map drawn in the constant shadow of flux. It helps us move through terrain that shifts under our feet. The senses provide data, sensations, impressions, appearances, but these are not themselves the final verdict. The mind must interpret, test, and revise. Axioms of this sort align with a skeptical temperament without conceding defeat to skepticism itself. We can know something, but what we know is liable to refinement as conditions change. Thus, knowledge is provisional, always subject to new configurations of cause and effect. Yet provisional does not mean vainly speculative. It means responsibly anchored in ongoing inquiry. The axiom asserts that wisdom consists not in clinging to certainties, but in cultivating the ability to revise our understanding when the river alters its course. It invites humility. Be ready to adjust, to reframe, to remeasure, and to accept that much of what we trust as knowledge is a snapshot rather than a statue. Axiom 7. The world as a living, breathing process. Time as the measure of becoming. Time, in Heraclitean thought, is not a mere metric by which events are ordered. It is the primary environment in which events unfold. The cosmos is a single, continuous act of becoming, and the human being participates in that act. The sense that something has become is the sense that the world has changed in relation to us, or we to it. Thus, temporality becomes a dimension through which ethical and epistemic claims must travel. If the world is alive, then our language about it must respect its vitality. Static abstractions fail where the life of the world continues to move. This axiom gives rise to a philosophy of attentiveness. Attend to the moment, observe the shifts, and allow the present to reframe what you believed was permanent. The moral implication is simple and demanding. Do not cling to yesterday's determinations as if they were tomorrow's. The present demands a new reading, a new alignment with the way things actually are, fluid, emergent, and inexhaustibly partial. Axiom 8. The law of becoming as a social and cosmological principle. While the prior axioms address ontological questions, this one addresses the periphery, how communities and civilizations arise from the same flux that animates nature. Societies are not steady machines. They are membranes through which the pressures of change pass and reshape the human fabric. Customs, laws, institutions. These are not eternal forms, but responsive arrangements that must negotiate the same rhythmic changes that govern the natural world. The corollary is a political ethics. Institutions ought to be flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions, yet stable enough to offer a sense of direction and meaning. To resist the currents indiscriminately is to court stagnation. To ride every tide with indiscriminate surrender is to lose one's bearings. The axiom thus supports a governance of dynamic balance. Preserve the moral horizon while allowing the living system to reconfigure itself in response to new circumstances. Axiom 9. The paradoxical art of living with and through contradiction. If opposites are essential to the fabric of reality, then living well requires an ability to hold paradox together without collapsing into one of its sides. This is not a license for confusion, but a cultivated art, to accommodate tension, to honor multiple perspectives, to recognize that simple solutions often mask deeper complexities. The paradox, properly understood, is not a failure of understanding, but a sign that understanding is still in progress. The axiom frames a way of life in which stubborn simplicity is questioned and where ethical choices emerge from the negotiation of competing aims. In practical terms, this means embracing dialectical thinking in everyday decision-making. The best policy may be a synthesis that preserves essential values on both sides of a dispute, or it may be a strategy that allows for evolution by alternating between standpoints as conditions require. Philosophically, it is a practice that keeps the mind flexible and the heart attentive, a refusal to cap reality with a single, triumphant answer when reality, by its very nature, refuses to be so capped. Axiom X. The normative humility of the student of flux, continual inquiry. The final axiom in this course set is a discipline more than a doctrine. Cultivate a lifelong habit of inquiry. If the world is a river, the student must be a swimmer who learns each stroke anew and who never presumes to own the current. This is the ethical posture of humility, to acknowledge how little one can know with finality and how much there is to relearn as conditions evolve. The student of flux, then, is not simply a seeker of novelty, but a caretaker of judgment, someone who recognizes that new horizons require new questions, and that old certainties may become shipwrecks when subjected to new tides. Together, these 10 axioms, though they can be clustered or reworded in varying editions, form the backbone of the ism that bears Heraclitus' name, and that the chapter's title casts in the light of Panta Rhei. A philosophy of becoming that refuses to be boxed, a method of seeing that refuses to surrender to the first glance, and a life lived in ardent fidelity to the living world as it unfolds. Axioms and dialogue, interpretive threads, and practical consequences. If one reads the axioms as rigid imperatives, they lose the very flexibility that makes Heraclitean thought compelling. It is in dialogue that the richness emerges. Each axiom speaks to another, sometimes reframing itself in response to a challenge, sometimes revealing a hidden edge when confronted by a counterexample. The philosophical trick is not to defend one dogma against all challengers, but to refine the understanding of change by inviting questions that test its limits. Take Axiom 2 and Axiom 3, for instance. Logos provides the map. Unity of opposites provides the terrain. A question arises. Can a map exist without the terrain to chart? Can the map accurately reflect a landscape if the landscape is in motion? The dialogue between these axioms yields a practical stance. Interpretive tools must be as dynamic as the world they seek to describe. Daring claims about fixed essences crumble under this test. Prudent claims about patterns that persist within change survive, but only as provisional guides. Similarly, Axiom 4, fire as the principle of transformation, must be balanced against Axiom 6, knowledge as provisional. If energy and transformation are primary, how does one know what to trust as knowledge? The answer lies in the logos. The structure by which we interpret data is itself a living, revisable instrument. The student of flux learns to weigh, revise, and reframe. The aim is not infallible certainty, but more reliable orientation in a world that refuses to stand still. Axioms for a modern reader, relevance and critique. Though these axioms were forged in the twilight of the ancient world, their relevance is not merely historical garnish. They offer a vocabulary for confronting present dissonances, climate change as a problem of flux, social identities as products of relational dynamics, technology as an accelerant of becoming, political institutions as fragile but purposeful arrangements that must adapt to new risks. The Heraclitean chest of tools, honesty about flux, respect for logos, recognition of opposites, and humility before the limits of knowledge, can serve as a counterweight to the anesthetic effects of cynicism and dogmatism. Yet the axioms are not a blueprint for easy optimism. They demand a maturity that acknowledges discomfort, discomfort with uncertainty, discomfort with the fragility of human constructs, discomfort with the fact that every solution births new questions. They also require a careful ethical stance. The claim that nothing endures is not a license for nihilism. It is a call to cultivate resilience, adaptability, and thoughtful action that remains anchored to shared purposes even as the conditions that define those purposes shift. The method of the axioms, how to engage with them. If a reader wishes to adopt the Heraclitean posture in daily life or in the practice of scholarship, the following method offers a practical entry point. Observe without assuming. Begin any inquiry by noting the phenomena as they present themselves, resisting the impulse to pin them down through premature judgments. Name the flux. Try to articulate what is changing, what elements of the situation might be in motion, and what ingredients of stability, if any, are providing a temporary anchor. Seek the logos. Look for the relational patterns that explain why the changes occur as they do, and beware oversimplifications that pretend to capture the whole with a single cause. Honor opposites. When confronted with a dilemma or a policy choice, acknowledge the legitimate claims on both sides and examine how the tension can be used to create a wiser synthesis rather than a hurried victory. Measure with care. Be explicit about the frame of reference you employ, and remain open to redefining that frame as conditions evolve. Test knowledge against experience. Let reflection be iterative. Revise theories in light of new observations, and recognize the provisional status of what counts as knowledge. Live the flux with responsibility. Practice a life of ethical responsiveness, where action is guided by reason, humility, and a willingness to adapt. Teach and learn in dialogue. The axioms are not monologues. They are invitations to conversation between generations, cultures, disciplines, and individuals. Axioms as living tradition. Integration into a broader portrait. These core axioms do not stand in isolation. They resonate with, and sometimes challenge, other streams of ancient philosophy, pre-Socratic naturalism, The sophistic emphasis on rhetoric and interpretation, later Platonic and Aristotelian attempts to stabilize form within flux. The movement called Panta-rhei, while indebted to Heraclitus, also engages with its own historical conversation. What does it mean to be a thinker in a world in which certainty has become a negotiable commodity? The chapter's aim is not to present a stagnant creed, but to present a living tradition. A tradition that insists that to know the world, one must learn to walk the edge between security and vulnerability, between doctrine and doubt, between the river's current and the ground beneath one's feet. In this light, the core axioms become a map not of a fixed destination but of a method of travel. They are the scaffolding for a building that changes shape as new floors rise and old walls lean in different directions. If Heraclitus is the man who saw fire in the furnace of becoming, the axioms are the guidelines for living within that furnace with clarity and courage. They insist that truth, in this worldview, is not a static jewel but a living flame, visible in the patterns of change, explainable in terms of relationship, and sustained by a disciplined practice of inquiry. Concluding reflections, the axioms as invitation rather than decree. The tenets outlined here do not pretend to exhaust the richness of Heraclitus' thought or to enumerate every nuance of the Panta-rheism. They are, rather, a framework, an invitation to think with the world rather than about it, to participate in the ancient art of living with the question rather than conquering the answer. They acknowledge the paradox that the more one learns about the flux, the more one realizes how little one can fix in place. They insist that a life of philosophy is a life of attentive listening to the drumbeat of change, a life of letting the world teach, prune, correct, and guide the mind. If the first chapter introduced a mind that refused to settle for the static, this chapter offers the scaffolding that supports that refusal, a constellation of propositions that, taken together, form a discipline for approaching reality with both rigor and reverence. The core axioms are not a law code, they are a compass. They do not guarantee a serene voyage through the seas of becoming, but they provide enough bearings to prevent one from being wrecked by the first storm or lulled into the safe harbor of illusion. In the end, they remind us of a simple truth that this movement has kept near to its heart. To know is to participate in the river, and to live is to keep walking along its ever-shifting banks, guided by a reason that can dance with change but not be sunk by it.